The other Allied commanders thought he was either bluffing or had finally cracked. The Germans were laughing too. Hitler's war machine had just detonated across the Ardennes like a thunderclap no one heard coming. A savage, coordinated surge that tore a gaping wound through the Allied line. Generals scrambled. Phones rang off hooks in command centers from Luxembourg to London. Maps were redrawn in panicked strokes. The press would soon name it the Bulge. But inside Wehrmacht headquarters, they called it something else: vindication. German commanders believed they had done what the experts said was impossible. Total strategic surprise against an enemy drunk on its own momentum, convinced the war was already won. 29 divisions, 250,000 troops, and 1,000 armored machines were now pouring westward through frozen woods toward Antwerp, aiming to split the British and American armies clean in half and force a peace treaty on Hitler's terms. The cold was a weapon, too. The temperatures had plunged to -7. American infantrymen shivered in cotton field jackets, their rifles seizing, their oil thickening to paste. Even the earth itself seemed to be fighting for Germany. Who, in God's name, could stop this? At the emergency conference in Verdun, Allied commanders sat ashen-faced around a table that felt like a courtroom for the condemned. Then a single voice cut through the silence. Clipped, unapologetic, almost offensively calm. "Why, I'll attack in 48 hours." Every head in the room turned, some with disbelief, some with pity. The man who said it wore a heavy winter parka over his 4 stars, his jaw set like poured concrete, his eyes carrying the unsettling certainty of someone who had already run this battle in his mind a dozen times. His face bore the sting of open Jeep winters, weathered, rigid, the face of a man who refused heated headquarters as a matter of principle. His name was George S. Patton, Jr., and at 59, and he had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this moment. The Germans had studied him. They feared him so deeply that when the Allies staged a fake invasion at Calais, they planted Patton as its commander, because German intelligence believed no bluff was credible without his name attached. They knew his aggression. They knew his audacity. What they did not know, what no one in that Verdun room fully understood yet, was that while they were reacting to the German attack, that Patton had already anticipated it. His staff had not drafted one contingency plan, not 2, 3. "Play ball," he would say into a telephone 24 hours later. 2 words that set 133,000 vehicles grinding northward through blizzard and blackout, executing a 90-degree pivot that military doctrine said was physically impossible in such conditions, in such time. The Germans were still laughing when the snow began to turn crimson. And this is the story of how one general's prepared mind and one army's savage refusal to break transformed Hitler's final gamble into the most catastrophic, strategic defeat Germany would suffer on the Western Front. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. The first reports came in fragments. Dawn on December 16th had barely broken over the Ardennes when the phones began screaming. A German thrust here, a roadblock overrun there. Then the fragments assembled into something that made veteran officers go pale. Not a probe, not a feint, but a full-throated assault across an 85-mile front, 3 armies wide, moving with a speed and ferocity that Allied intelligence had sworn was no longer possible. The Wehrmacht, supposedly broken and retreating, had somehow conjured 29 divisions from the winter fog and sent them crashing westward like a fist through wet paper. The hole they tore was not a gap, it was a wound. German armor didn't advance, it flooded. Panzers and half-tracks poured through the breach in columns that stretched back beyond the horizon, their engines roaring through snow-silenced forests that had, until that morning, been considered a quiet sector, a rest sector, a place where exhausted divisions were sent to recover, not to fight. The Americans holding those positions were spread thin, some units covering frontages 3 times what doctrine allowed. They had no idea what was coming until it was already on top of them. Entire battalions were cut off before they could report their own positions. Communications collapsed. Command posts went silent mid-transmission. The neat lines on Allied maps became fiction within hours. In rear headquarters, the chaos arrived as noise first, overlapping radio calls. Our runners arriving breathless with coordinates that were already obsolete. Officers staring at situation maps that couldn't keep pace with the collapse. The word moving through the corridors was not attack. It was disaster. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower absorbed the reports with the controlled stillness of a man refusing to let his face show what his stomach already knew. This was not a spoiling attack. This was not desperation. Hitler had been hiding something: men, armor, the fuel. And now he had uncorked it all at once, aiming the full weight of Germany's last strategic reserve at the seam between the British and American armies. The objective was Antwerp. If the Germans reached it, they'd split the Allied front, encircle 4 armies, and buy themselves the breathing room to negotiate. The English Channel would do the rest. For that to work, speed was everything. And speed, in those first 48 hours, was entirely on Germany's side. Eisenhower called the emergency conference for December 19th in Verdun, a city whose name alone carried the weight of 1 million dead from the last war. The meeting room was cold in the way that important rooms become cold when the news is bad enough, functionally heated, psychologically frigid. Senior commanders arrived with the careful expressions of men trying not to look as frightened as they were. The maps on the wall told a story no one wanted to read aloud. The Bulge, as it was already being called, had pushed 50 miles into Allied territory. Bastogne, a critical crossroads town, was surrounded. The 101st Airborne was inside it, encircled, outnumbered, and holding on through sheer obstinacy. Something had to move, and it had to move now. Eisenhower opened by acknowledging the obvious. The situation was grave. Then he asked the question that hung over the room like smoke. Who could counterattack, and when? And the responses were what careful men give when they don't want to be wrong. Cautious timelines, logistical qualifications, the language of men buying time they didn't have. Then Patton spoke. "I'll attack with 3 divisions on the morning of December 22nd. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of agreement, but the quiet of collective disbelief, struggling to present itself as polite skepticism. 3 days. And he was promising a fully coordinated counterattack with 3 divisions in 3 days, in conditions that made large-scale movement a logistical nightmare under the best circumstances. His Third Army was currently oriented eastward, engaged along a completely different axis. What he was describing wasn't just a counterattack. It was a 90-degree pivot of an entire army. Hundreds of thousands of men and machines, rotating on a dime in sub-zero temperatures. Through road networks already choked with snow, refugees, and retreating units. Eisenhower studied him from across the table. "Don't be fatuous, George." Patton didn't blink. He had anticipated this moment as carefully as he had anticipated the German attack itself. Before anyone in that room had known the offensive was coming, before the 1st Panzer crossed the line of departure, his staff had already drafted contingency plans. Not 1, not 2, 3 separate operational blueprints, each keyed to a different scenario, each waiting for nothing more than a 2-word phone call to activate. He had rehearsed this conference in his mind before he drove to it. He knew what he was going to say. He knew what they were going to doubt. He had done the arithmetic. He told Eisenhower he wasn't guessing. He told him the plans already existed. He told him the order had effectively already been given. All that remained was to make it official. The silence in the room changed character. and disbelief began to shade reluctantly into something closer to hope. The phone call came through that same evening. Patton lifted the receiver, listened for the confirmation, and spoke 2 words into the line before hanging up. "Play ball." Somewhere to the north, a staff officer who had been waiting beside his own telephone for exactly those words turned to his team and repeated them. And then the machine, the enormous, intricate, an improbable machine that Patton had quietly preloaded like a weapon, began to move. 133,000 vehicles, 6 divisions, trucks, tanks, tank destroyers, artillery pieces, ambulances, fuel tankers, half-tracks, jeeps, all of it pivoting northward in the dark, on roads that weren't designed for this volume, in weather that wasn't designed for human beings. Traffic control officers stood at crossroads in -7 temperatures, directing columns that seemed to have no end. Supply sergeants worked through the night redistributing ammunition and fuel loads that had been oriented for a completely different fight. Signal units pulled wire and re-established communications along axes that hadn't existed on any operational map 72 hours earlier. It should not have been possible. Military doctrine, German doctrine specifically, which was at that point the most respected operational doctrine in the world, held that a formation of this size required a minimum of a week to reorient along a new axis. More in winter, more still in these conditions. The German commanders who would later learn what Patton had done would find it difficult to accept as fact. They had built their offensive plan partly on the assumption that American forces to the south could not respond meaningfully in time. That assumption was now accelerating northward at the speed of a logistics miracle. For the men on the road, it was not a miracle. It was suffering, ordered and endured. The cold was not the cold of discomfort. It was the cold of equipment failure and frostbite, and the specific misery of men dressed for a war that had been expected to end before winter arrived. American infantrymen had been issued cotton field jackets and wool overcoats, adequate for autumn, a catastrophic for an Ardennes December that was recording temperatures not seen in a generation. Fingers lost sensation inside gloves that were already inadequate. Feet went numb inside boots that had not been designed for prolonged exposure. Men learned to keep moving not because they wanted to, but because stopping meant freezing. The machines suffered alongside their crews. Engine oil thickened in the cold until it barely flowed, and vehicle engines had to be turned over every 30 minutes through the night, not to warm the men, but to keep the steel alive. Mechanics worked in the open, their hands bare against metal so cold it stuck to skin, coaxing equipment back into function with tools that didn't want to be held. Artillery pieces that had been zeroed for one front had to be re-zeroed for another. Radio batteries drained faster in the cold. Everything that could go wrong with machines in winter was going wrong simultaneously, across a 100-mile column moving through darkness toward a fight that hadn't started yet. And still they moved. There was something in it, in the specific momentum of men who have been told to do an impossible thing by someone who seems to genuinely believe it isn't, that carried its own heat. Not warmth, not comfort, but the particular energy of collective commitment to a course already chosen. And the order had been given. The plan existed. The man who made the promise had already accounted for the obstacles. That knowledge didn't make the cold less cold, but it made the column keep moving. Patton knew what moving columns needed, and it wasn't heated offices. He had made his position on rear echelon comfort perfectly clear years earlier and saw no reason to revisit it now. While other senior commanders maintained command posts in requisitioned buildings with functioning heat and the administrative infrastructure of high command, Patton traveled in an open jeep. No windscreen to cut the wind, no heated cab to insulate him from the temperature his soldiers were living in. His parka, a heavy one, his one visible concession to the -7 reality around him, was the same parka he'd been photographed in, argued in, and driven across 2 countries in. His face, already weathered into something resembling carved stone, had acquired an additional quality in the Ardennes cold, a fixed, forward-facing severity that men who saw him on the roadside remembered long after they'd forgotten everything else about the campaign. This was deliberate, not performance, or not only performance. Patton understood something about command that required no doctrine manual to learn. Soldiers endure what they can see their leader enduring. An army that knows its general is warm does not move with the same energy as an army that watches him drive past in an open vehicle at -7, face into the wind, seemingly unbothered. The latter army moves faster. It asks fewer questions. It makes the call that there is no option being withheld from it, no comfort being hoarded at the top. Old blood and guts. And that's what they called him. A nickname that had survived slapping incidents and press controversies and the sustained disapproval of people who believed generals should be more careful with their reputations. Out here, on these roads, with these temperatures and these stakes, the nickname wasn't press copy. It was a description. The man was here, in it, the same as them. More, perhaps, because the Jeep had no roof and he hadn't asked for one. Soldiers standing at roadside checkpoints, stamping their feet against the cold, would see the Jeep coming. Open, fast, the 4-star plates identifiable from a distance, and straighten without being told to. Something in the sight of him recalibrated what was bearable. If he could do it, they could do it. If he was pointing north, north was where they were going. The cold remained cold. The road remained brutal. Bastogne remained surrounded. But the column kept moving. 133,000 vehicles, rolling north through the frozen dark toward a battle that German commanders had already decided was impossible to reach in time. Patton had something to say about that, too. He just hadn't said it yet. General Erich Brandenberger had built his portion of the offensive on a calculation that seemed, at the time, mathematically sound. The American Third Army was engaged to the southeast. It was oriented eastward, tied up in its own fight, logistically committed to a different axis. And even if Patton recognized the threat to Bastogne immediately, even if he moved the moment the order came, the geometry of the situation made a meaningful southern counterattack a physical impossibility inside of a week. Brandenberger had done the math. His staff had done the math. The math was not complicated. What the math had not accounted for was that Patton had already done different math, arrived at a different answer, and started moving before anyone asked him to. The first intelligence reports filtering back to German command in those early days carried an oddness that nobody quite knew how to categorize. Vehicle movement, southward to northward traffic patterns on roads that should have been quiet, supply columns reorienting, signal intercepts suggesting Third Army communications had shifted axis. Each data point individually meant nothing. Assembled together, and they began to suggest something that Brandenberger's operational framework had no category for. He requested confirmation. Confirmation came. Patton was moving. Not preparing to move, not conducting reconnaissance, moving with mass, with speed, with the full coordinated weight of an army that had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment to pivot and strike. The realization that settled over German Southern Command was not the sharp shock of surprise. It was the slower, a more disorienting horror of understanding that your opponent had anticipated your plan, prepared his counter before you executed your attack, and was now performing a maneuver your own doctrine said was impossible, in conditions your own commanders had cited as guarantees of American paralysis. The winter, which Germany had counted as an ally, had not slowed Patton at all. It had simply been the backdrop against which he had already decided to move. Inside Bastogne, the math was different and considerably more brutal. The 101st Airborne Division had not chosen to be there. They had been rushed into the town as the German offensive exploded around them, arriving with incomplete equipment, limited ammunition, and no clear picture of how many German units were closing in from how many directions. What they understood quickly was this: the roads out of Bastogne were gone. German forces had sealed them. The 101st was encircled, outnumbered, and holding a perimeter in a town that the German command needed to take in order to keep their offensive arteries open. The men who held that perimeter were not holding it comfortably. German artillery found the town with a regularity that reduced buildings to rubble and rubble to dust. Tiger tanks, massive, nearly impervious steel machines that American anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate frontally, probed the perimeter looking for seams. And the temperature inside Bastogne was the same temperature as everywhere else in the Ardennes. The wounded froze. Medical supplies ran short. Ammunition was rationed with the kind of precision that only becomes necessary when running out is a real possibility. And then the Germans sent a delegation with a formal written demand for surrender. The document was carefully composed. It cited the hopelessness of the American position, the overwhelming force arrayed against the garrison, and the opportunity to avoid further unnecessary casualties. It was, by the conventions of such things, a reasonable document. It was delivered under flag of truce to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who read it, set it down, and reportedly said one word before his staff asked him what his formal reply should be. Nuts. His staff suggested that was, in fact, the reply. McAuliffe agreed. The German delegation received a written response. Formal, signed, at one word, and returned to their lines to translate it. The translation caused some confusion. An American officer was consulted for clarification on the precise meaning. He told them, in terms that left no ambiguity, that it meant the same thing in German. The answer was no. The answer was contempt. The answer was that the 101st Airborne had assessed the situation and found the German arithmetic unpersuasive. The perimeter held. The town burned, and the wounded were moved to the relative shelter of what remained standing. And through the trees to the south, 133,000 vehicles kept grinding northward through the dark. What the 101st needed and what Patton needed was sky. The Ardennes in December does not offer sky generously. Low cloud had been the offensive's silent accomplice from the beginning, grounding Allied air power, in neutralizing the one advantage that American forces held so decisively that German planners had specifically chosen winter for the attack. No sky meant no fighter bombers. No fighter bombers meant German armor could move freely, resupply columns could roll without harassment, and the panzers at Bastogne's perimeter could press without the sudden, terrible violence of an airstrike turning the road ahead into a graveyard of burning steel. The clouds had been there since the 16th, and they showed no intention of leaving. Patton, who was not a conventionally religious man, but was a man who believed in covering every available axis, spiritual included, ordered a prayer. Specifically, he had his chaplain compose a request for clear weather, and he had it printed and distributed to the men of Third Army. It was not a subtle document. It asked God directly for the kind of weather that would allow the destruction of the enemy. Though Patton reportedly also had a personal conversation with the Almighty on the subject, the content of which was not recorded, but whose tone, given the man involved, was almost certainly more demand than petition. On December 23rd, the clouds broke. What followed was not mercy. It was mechanical and precise and absolute. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs descended on the Ardennes like a verdict. German supply columns that had been moving freely for a week were caught in the open and destroyed. Panzer concentrations that had relied on cloud cover for protection found instead that the sky had become lethal. Fuel convoys that Hitler's offensive depended on to sustain its momentum were hit before they could deliver. The fighter bombers worked roads, rail lines, crossroads, and in troop concentrations with the focused energy of forces that had been grounded for a week and were not inclined toward restraint. Patton watched the aircraft working the horizon and said nothing on record that has survived. He didn't need to. The sky was doing his talking. December 26th arrived in the particular gray of an Ardennes winter morning that has no interest in being dramatic. The cold was the same cold it had been for 10 days. The snow was the same snow. They're packed now and stained in places the color of rust. The tree lines that had been shredding American formations since the offensive began stood the same as always, offering the same combination of cover and concealment to whoever happened to be dying inside them. The 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division had been fighting its way north for days, not in a clean doctrinal advance, but in the grinding, costly, attritional work of breaking through a defensive belt that the Germans had organized specifically to prevent relief from reaching Bastogne. Every mile had cost something. Tanks had burned. Men had gone down in the snow and stayed there. The roads leading north were marked by the debris of a column that had refused repeatedly to stop. On the afternoon of December 26th, the 37th cracked the last German position standing between them and the perimeter. The corridor they opened was not wide. 500 yards, barely enough for vehicles to pass through without inviting the fire from both sides that would close it again. But width was not the point. The point was that it existed, that American armor was moving through it, that the encirclement, the thing that was supposed to be permanent, the thing the Germans had built their offensive timeline around, had been broken. Inside Bastogne, men who had been holding a perimeter for 10 days heard the sound of American tank engines from the south and understood what it meant before anyone told them. The relief was not the kind that produces celebration. It was the quieter, more internal kind. The release of a sustained tension that the body has been holding so long it had started to feel like the natural state of things. They had held. The line had come to them. Patton received the report. He acknowledged it. But then he gave his next order. Bastogne was not the destination. It had never been the destination. This was the part that separated Patton's operational thinking from the instinct of commanders who had been fighting defensively for too long. The relief of Bastogne was the headline. The corridor was the photograph. What mattered, what Patton had been calculating since the moment he said play ball, was not saving the town, but destroying the army that had surrounded it. The German spearhead, or the armored formations that had driven deepest into the Bulge, had been sustained by supply lines that ran through and around Bastogne. With the perimeter broken and American forces now pressing from multiple directions, those supply lines were becoming nooses. Patton ordered the drive to continue, not just to widen the corridor, not just to consolidate the relief, but to push north toward Houffalize, to link with Allied forces coming south from the other side of the Bulge, began to close the pocket around everything Germany had committed to this offensive. The German formations that had been the tip of Hitler's final spear, the ones that had come closest to reaching the Meuse, the ones that had advanced the furthest, that had cost the most to stop, found themselves in the position they had designed for others, cut off, encircled, their supply lines severed by the same relentless pressure they had applied to Bastogne. But the strategic reserve that Hitler had hoarded for months, the force he had assembled in secret and launched with the intention of changing the fundamental shape of the war, it was being fed into a machine it could not back out of. The Americans called it the meat grinder. What Patton understood, and what took the Germans longer to accept, was that the grinder's handle was in American hands now. By the time the two Allied forces met at Houffalize in January, the Bulge had ceased to exist as a military reality. The terrain the Germans had captured at such cost was reclaimed. The formations that had advanced so dramatically in those first December days were shattered, depleted of the tanks, the fuel, the trained men that could not be replaced. Germany had committed its reserve and lost it. The Western Front, which Hitler had intended to crack open, had instead consumed the last instrument he possessed to change its outcome. But the war did not end that day. There were months yet to go, rivers to cross, cities to take. the terrible final accounting that comes when a military force fights on past the point where winning remains possible. But the shape of the end had been decided in the Ardennes, in the frozen woods, on the crimson roads between Luxembourg and Bastogne. Patton drove north through it all in his open Jeep, face into the wind, 4 stars on the bumper. At the parka, his one concession to a winter that had failed to stop him. He had spent 59 years getting ready for 10 days. The Germans had been given every advantage: surprise, weather, terrain, the accumulated momentum of a bold and desperate plan. They had done everything right except account for one man who had already seen them coming, already made his plans, already sent the order before they fired the first shot. They had been laughing in December. By January, the laughter was gone, along with the army that had made it. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II, and comment where you're watching from.